Hello. This is a brief introduction to both the September and the October 2015 topics. September is full of holidays and school startings and so forth. And so I thought I would combine the two of them since these introductions are somewhat brief. In September, the monthly study guide addresses self-identification, identifying the self. And then in October, we're going to be looking at faith and doubt. What's the relationship there? In order to do some of this spiritual work, we are addressing fundamental beliefs in our system. We're questioning what we were taught as children. We're questioning what we were taught as adolescents and as adults. We're trying to find our belief as separate from group beliefs, societal beliefs, cultural, national beliefs. In order to do that, we need to know who we are. Who is the person asking the question? Pathwork addresses this by looking at different layers of our being. The terminology is unique to any group that works like this. We call it ego, higher self, lower self, mask. But all these terms are trying to do is to identify different aspects of who we are, because, of course, we are all of these. But when we ask questions about choices we have made, it's easier to see it sometimes as one part of us questioning another part of us. A very useful lecture to do this work with is Pathwork Lecture 182, and the nickname for that is Meditation with Three Chairs, where we follow the principles of voice dialogue, and we try to identify the part of us that feels that it is the ego, the part of us that feels that it is a frustrated child. And to do this work, the first thing we have to do is address the part of us that we, as best we can, identify as our higher self, as our divine self. Now, Pathwork has a lot of different lectures on these topics. There's no right way to study them, but what I recommend is that you go to the index. There are several on my website, and there are indexes at the Pathwork Foundation website, www.pathwork.org, and look through the titles and see what appeals to you. So we might have 10 lectures on a topic, but one may strike you as more interesting than another. That's the one I would recommend that you read. In terms of the ego, in previous monthly study guides, we've studied, for instance, Pathwork Lecture 60, which is about the abyss of illusion. And what that's about is the illusion that the next step you're going to take is huge, massive, incomprehensible, unknown, frightening, potentially devastating. It is in the illusion that there is an abyss. And part of what happens here is that our ego, that I like to frame, or I use a little image of it being a traffic cop. And the image is in charge of getting us up and figuring out what's in the pantry and making sure we catch the train, the subway, drive the car correctly. And the ego's job is like a middle-level bureaucrat. And sometimes that bureaucrat thinks that it runs the whole show. And when it has things in order, it does not like anything disrupted. But there is a part of us that is divine, that is not, it isn't active in these day-to-day, relatively mundane decisions. You can think of that like an executive function, the part of us that makes policy, the part of us that decides what direction we're going in, and the ego carries it out. But sometimes the ego gets invested in its routines, in its systems, and doesn't want to change. And so one of the ways it tries to hold control, hold power, is to scare us off. Oh, that's going to be too hard. Oh, that's very, very difficult. making all these excuses and sounds and dramatizing and exaggerating how difficult it will be to make changes. So what we're identifying when we say identification of the self or self-identification is we're trying to discern the difference between the part of us that feels inspired, that feels called, that feels drawn to things, versus the part of us that likes order, uh, gets upset with confusion, or sometimes enjoys confusion and chaos and doesn't want to clean things up. So it's a unique and individual expression of how we feel comfortable in the world. So when that divine center, whatever you wish to call it, higher self, real self, divine self, when that part of us wants to make a change, it can feel like trying to remodel the foundations of who we are that everything else is built on. And there is naturally a protest from the systems that have been built on certain belief systems. So again, the Abyss of Illusion lecture goes into that. I think a year and a half ago, we studied the function of the ego, which is Pathwork Lecture 132. This month, it's Pathwork Lecture 189, Identification with the Self. And next month, we're going to be looking at Pathwork Lecture 221, Faith and Doubt and Truth and Distortion. So my hope, my intent, was to reiterate the sense of self before we looked at faith and doubt. So that when we look at faith and doubt, we're looking at it from the perspective of the higher self, the real self, the deeper, more divine part of us. So let me switch to faith and doubt for just a moment. When looking at faith and doubt, the lecture was fairly easy to delineate down to 4 steps. And the first and second step are taking leaps. You simply believe something needs to be done. You believe something needs to be learned, explored, changed. Step number 3 is described as the process where sometimes you get it and sometimes you lose it. And then you get it and lose it, get it and lose it. And step 4 is when you've got it, you may not understand it, but you've got it. And you don't lose track of what you believe, even as you explore further or refine or learn to verbalize what that's all about. To do all these things, it's important to know what protests you are making, where they're coming from, what layers of your personality might be the input it might be given. So once again, step 3 is when you're on, off, but the essence there that's important to remember is you know when you're on and you know when you're off. So there's a very deep knowing there. If you don't know what it is, you know when you don't have it. And that's a level of knowing, and it may not feel good. You may not feel like you can build something with that knowledge, but without that, how can you possibly stay once you have identified it more fully? So it's a little bit like riding a bicycle. Once you get it, but until you do, it's a little mystical. How do you retain your balance? In terms of step 1 and 2, these leaps that the guide suggests, once again, I'm talking about the October topic, Pathwork Lecture 221, Faith and Doubt. The first 2 steps of making a leap is like falling in love. Now, falling in love with a romantic partner is fairly common. We also fall in love with ideas. We fall in love with professions. We fall in love with groups. We fall in love with friends. We fall in love with furnishings where we are absolutely passionately in love with a certain sofa or even a thing in our homes. Every time we see it, our heart just opens. These are all leaps. We may not recognize it as a leap. When you do that, there's It's not an intellectual, rationalized process. We simply decide something is good for us and we want more. Now, when I was giving a presentation the other night, I stood up and did a little demonstration, which feels appropriate, even though I'm not going to do it here. And that is that I moved over to the seat next to me and sat down and talked about faith and doubt and how we have more examples of faith in our daily life than we realize. We don't identify certain behaviors as faith. And then I got up and, without looking, sat in the chair next to me. And the example I was working towards was I had faith that the chair would be there. Now, what happens sometimes is the chair's not there. We are shocked, surprised, hurt, land on the floor, but we naturally try to figure out what happened. And we look at our belief system. How did I miss the potential for that chair not to be there? Now, I'm describing a very mundane thing, but imagine that if every time you went into a different room in your home or your office, the room was different than it was the last time you entered it. We would look for explanations. We would look for understanding of this. And once we found an understanding that suited us, we will relax again into the new world order, the new way of understanding gravity, the new way of understanding how chairs get up and move, the new understanding, for instance, when they figured out that the earth moved around the sun instead of sun moving around the earth. It's a way of talking about things. We had to change certain phrasings. We had to change an attitude because we had to accept things from a different perspective. It takes a while, and then we relax into that. And then we learn more, and we may have to shift again to include that information. There's a place of faith where you walk into another room in your home and you expect to find things where they are, and they are there. And I don't want to go into too much detail, but my recommendation to the group was to notice different places in your life where one of the steps of faith appears. Now, you're not in the same step of faith. The guide alternates back and forth between the word step and stage, so a little confusing sometimes. To notice which step you're in at any given moment. So in some parts of your life, you are in step 4. You know something. And anytime there's a disruption to that reality, you know how to get back on the horse. You know how to restabilize. Then there are examples of stage 3, where you are trying to learn something new and you forget. You can't organize your head with a new attitude, and then you remember the attitude. That's step 3. And then there are the small examples in life where we are making leaps of faith. So that's the section on faith. And then there is a section on doubt. And it's interesting. I hope you take a look at it, either on my website or the entire lecture. And the section on doubt talks about real doubt and false doubt. Gives an example of a dishonest doubt. And a dishonest doubt is a doubt where you really don't want to believe something anyway. So in other words, it serves your interest to doubt something because it disturbs you that it would be a certain way. You don't want to hear about it. You don't want to think about it, and you certainly don't want to accept it. But instead of saying, I don't believe it, I don't want to talk about it, which could make us look ignorant or closed-minded or rude, we express, I don't think so, I'm not sure I believe in that. And this lecture is about taking a look at a few examples in your life where you may be expressing dishonest doubt. And then there is real doubt. And we are to honor that. Even in the Pathwork lectures, the guide says, don't take all this verbatim, prove it. Take the information, take the text, take the ideas, take them into your daily life. Notice what happens in life. Change, and notice what happens when you change. Test out these ideas. Because just repeating things on faith is an old-fashioned concept of faith, blind faith, that we may have grown up from. We may be maturing as a species from having to just believe on blind faith. We may be able to enlarge our knowledge and our understanding so that we don't have to have blind faith. We can have faith that is based upon our efforts at understanding. And yet there's always a little gap in our understanding where we do choose to believe in things that we can't prove to a rational understanding. So please feel free to download the study guide from my website, www.janrigsby.com, or the lecture from the Pathwork Foundation site. Thanks for watching. Take care.